It was one of those cold winter evenings when the wind cut through your clothes no matter how many layers you wore. The kind of night when most people rush home, lock their doors, and thank God for a warm place to sleep. But not everyone has that luxury. Not everyone has a door to lock or a bed waiting for them. On a quiet street corner in the city, there was a small Italian restaurant. It had been there for nearly 40 years. The walls were old, the chairs didn't match, and the menu hadn't changed in decades. But people loved it. They came for the food, yes, but also for the warmth. Not just the warmth from the kitchen, but the feeling you got when you walked in. It felt like home. The owner was a man in his early 60s named Giovanni. He had taken over the restaurant from his father, who had taken it from his father before him. 3 generations of the same family, cooking the same recipes, serving the same neighborhood. Giovanni was a big man with rough hands and a loud laugh. He knew almost every customer by name. He remembered their orders, their birthdays, even the names of their children. That was the kind of man he was. On this particular night, the restaurant was about half full. A young couple sat near the window, sharing a plate of pasta and stealing glances at each other. A family of 4 was celebrating something, maybe a birthday, maybe just the joy of being together. An elderly man sat alone at a corner table, slowly eating his soup and staring out the window like he was lost in old memories. And a group of college students laughed loudly near the back, enjoying their Friday night. Giovanni stood behind the counter, wiping down glasses and keeping an eye on everything. He liked this part of the evening. The rush was over, the kitchen was calm, and he could just watch his little world spin quietly. That's when the door opened. A young woman stepped inside. She looked to be in her late 20s, maybe early 30s. It was hard to tell. Her face was thin, her cheeks hollow. Her clothes were old and didn't fit right. A faded coat hung loose on her shoulders, and her shoes were worn down to almost nothing. She carried no purse, no bag, nothing at all. Just herself. She stood near the entrance for a moment, looking around the room like she wasn't sure if she belonged there. And honestly, by the look on some of the customers' faces, a few of them weren't sure either. People glanced at her, then looked away. It was that uncomfortable kind of silence that happens when someone who doesn't quite fit walks into a room. Giovanni watched her carefully. He had seen people like her before. The city was full of them. People who had fallen through the cracks. People who had once had normal lives but had somehow ended up with nothing. He never judged them. Life was hard, and he knew better than anyone that luck could run out when you least expected it. The woman walked slowly toward the counter. Her steps were careful, like she was trying not to make too much noise. When she reached Giovanni, she didn't speak right away. She just stood there, her eyes looking down at the floor. Giovanni leaned forward a little. "Can I help you?" he asked. His voice was gentle, not the loud, booming tone he used with his regular customers. The woman looked up. Her eyes were tired, but there was something else in them too. Something that looked almost like hope, or maybe desperation. It was hard to say which. "I haven't eaten in 3 days," she said quietly. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper. "I know I don't have any money. I know how this looks. But I'm not here to beg." Giovanni didn't say anything. He just waited. The woman glanced over at the corner of the room, where an old piano sat covered in dust. It had been there for as long as anyone could remember. Giovanni's father had bought it decades ago, thinking it would add some class to the place. For a while, they even had a pianist who came on weekends. But that was years ago. Now, the piano just sat there, untouched and forgotten. "That piano," the woman said, pointing toward it. "Does it still work?" Giovanni raised an eyebrow. "I think so. Haven't heard anyone play it in years, though." The woman took a deep breath. "If I play something for your customers, would you let me have a meal? Just something small. Anything. I'll earn it. I promise." Giovanni looked at her for a long moment. He wasn't sure what to think. Part of him wanted to just give her food and send her on her way. But something about the way she asked stopped him. She wasn't begging. She was offering something in return. There was pride in her voice. even through the exhaustion. He thought about it for a few seconds. What was the harm? If she was terrible, he would politely stop her and still give her something to eat. And if she was good, well, maybe the customers would enjoy it. Either way, he had nothing to lose. All right, he said finally. Go ahead. But if people start complaining, you'll have to stop. Fair enough? Quote, the woman nodded quickly. Fair enough. Thank you. She walked over to the piano slowly, like she was approaching an old friend she hadn't seen in years. She pulled out the bench and sat down carefully. Her hands hovered over the keys for a moment, trembling slightly. Whether it was from the cold, from hunger, or from something else entirely, no one could tell. The customers in the restaurant barely noticed her at first. The couple by the window was still lost in their own world. The family was busy with their celebration. The college students were too loud to care about anything else. Only the elderly man in the corner looked up from his soup and watched her with quiet curiosity. Giovanni leaned against the counter and crossed his arms. He wasn't expecting much. Maybe a simple tune, something basic. Enough to earn a plate of food and call it a night. But then her fingers touched the keys, and everything changed. The first note rang out clear and pure, cutting through the noise of the restaurant like a beam of light through darkness. Then came another note, and another, building into something beautiful and haunting. It was classical music, the kind you hear in grand concert halls, not in small family restaurants on cold winter nights. Within seconds, the room went silent. The young couple stopped eating and turned to look. The family paused their celebration, their forks frozen in midair. The college students stopped laughing. Even the noise from the kitchen seemed to fade away. As if the cooks had stopped what they were doing to listen, Giovanni felt a chill run down his spine. He had heard music before. He had even been to a few concerts in his life. But this was different. This wasn't just playing. This was something else entirely. It was like the woman was pouring her entire soul into that piano, every note carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. The elderly man in the corner set down his spoon and stared at her, his eyes growing wet. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound in the entire restaurant was the music, rising and falling like waves on a stormy sea. And Giovanni realized, in that moment, that this woman was no ordinary stranger. She was something special, something the world had somehow forgotten, and she had just walked into his restaurant, asking only for a chance. The music filled every corner of that small restaurant like nothing anyone had ever heard before. It wasn't just sound. It was feeling. It was emotion given shape and form. Every note seemed to carry something heavy, something real, something that reached deep into your chest and grabbed hold of your heart. The woman's fingers moved across the keys with a kind of grace that seemed almost impossible. Her eyes were closed, her body swaying gently with the rhythm. She wasn't just playing the piano, she was speaking through it, telling a story without words, a story of pain, of loss, of longing, and somewhere beneath it all, a tiny flicker of hope that refused to die. Giovanni stood frozen behind the counter. His arms were still crossed, but his mouth had fallen open slightly. In all his years running this restaurant, he had never seen anything like this. He had hosted birthday parties and anniversary dinners. He had seen people laugh, cry, argue, and make up, but he had never witnessed a moment quite like this one. The young couple near the window had completely forgotten about their food. The woman had tears streaming down her face, and she didn't even bother to wipe them away. Her partner reached across the table and took her hand, squeezing it gently. Neither of them said a word. They didn't need to. The family that had been celebrating stopped everything. The children, who had been restless and noisy just minutes before, now sat perfectly still. The little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, stared at the woman at the piano with wide eyes full of wonder. She tugged on her mother's sleeve and whispered, "Mommy, who is she?" But her mother just shook her head slowly, too moved to speak. Even the college students in the back had gone quiet. These were young people who probably spent most of their time listening to loud music and scrolling through their phones. But now, their phones sat forgotten on the table. One of them, a young man with messy hair and a wrinkled jacket, had his hands clasped together, like he was praying. Another one, a girl with bright red lipstick, had tears in her eyes and didn't seem to care who saw them. But it was the elderly man in the corner who seemed most affected by the music. He had stopped eating completely. His spoon lay abandoned beside his bowl. His hands were trembling slightly as they rested on the table. His eyes never left the woman at the piano, and tears rolled freely down his wrinkled cheeks. He knew this piece. He knew it very well. It was Chopin. One of the most difficult and beautiful compositions ever written. He had heard it performed many times in his life, in concert halls and theaters all over the world, but he had never heard it played quite like this. There was something raw about it, something unpolished but deeply honest. It was the kind of playing that came not from years of practice alone, but from years of living, years of suffering, years of holding on when everything inside you wanted to let go. The music rose and fell like the tide. Sometimes it was soft and gentle, like a whisper in the dark. Other times it crashed forward with power and intensity, filling the room with sound so rich it almost felt physical. And through it all, the woman at the piano never opened her eyes. She was somewhere else entirely, lost in a world that only she could see. Giovanni noticed that his own eyes had grown wet. He quickly wiped them with the back of his hand, hoping no one had seen. But when he looked around the room, he realized it didn't matter. Almost everyone was crying, and no one was ashamed of it. There was something about the music that stripped away all the walls people put up, all the masks they wore. In that moment, there were no strangers in the restaurant, just people, brought together by something beautiful and unexpected. The piece lasted about 10 minutes, though it felt both longer and shorter at the same time. Longer because every second was filled with so much emotion. Shorter because no one wanted it to end. And then, finally, it did. The last note hung in the air for a moment, soft and lingering, like the final breath of something sacred. Then, silence. Complete and total silence. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as if the whole world had paused to honor what had just happened. The woman at the piano slowly lowered her hands to her lap. Her shoulders were shaking slightly. She kept her head bowed, her eyes still closed, as if she was afraid to look up and see the faces around her. Then, from the corner of the room, came a sound. It was the elderly man. He had pushed back his chair and risen to his feet. His movements were slow and unsteady, but there was purpose in them. He brought his hands together and began to clap. The sound echoed through the silent restaurant. Clap, clap, clap. Slow and deliberate. Each one filled with meaning. Then the young woman near the window stood up. She started clapping too, faster now, tears still wet on her cheeks. Her partner joined her. Then the family. Then the college students. One by one, every single person in that restaurant rose to their feet. The applause grew louder and louder until it filled the room completely. People weren't just clapping. They were cheering. Some were wiping their eyes. Others were shaking their heads in disbelief, as if they still couldn't process what they had just witnessed. Giovanni stepped out from behind the counter and joined in. He clapped harder than he had clapped for anything in years. His heart was full in a way he couldn't quite explain. The woman at the piano finally looked up. Her face was wet with tears. She looked around the room at all these strangers standing and applauding for her. And something in her expression broke. Not in a bad way, in the way that ice breaks in spring, in the way that dawn breaks after a long, dark night. She tried to smile, but it came out shaky and uncertain. She wasn't used to this. That much was clear. She wasn't used to being seen, to being heard, to being valued. Giovanni walked over to her slowly. The applause was starting to fade now, but the energy in the room remained. Everyone was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. He stopped a few feet away from her and spoke gently. "That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard in my life." The woman looked at him for a long moment. Her lips trembled. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again. It was like she didn't know how to answer. Like she had forgotten who she was a long time ago. Finally, she found her voice. "I'm nobody," she said quietly. "Just someone who used to have a dream." Giovanni shook his head slowly. "No, you're not nobody. Not after what you just did. Please, tell me your story." The woman looked down at the piano keys, worn and yellowed with age. She ran her fingers over them gently, like she was saying goodbye to an old friend. "It's a long story," she whispered. Giovanni pulled up a chair and sat down across from her. "I've got all night," he said, "and I think everyone here does too." He glanced around the room. No one had left. No one had even sat back down. They were all still standing there, watching, waiting, wanting to know more about this mysterious woman who had walked in from the cold and touched their hearts in ways they couldn't explain. The woman took a deep breath. And then, slowly, she began to speak. The restaurant had grown quiet again. Not the heavy silence of before, but a gentle, respectful stillness. Everyone had slowly returned to their seats, but no one was eating. No one was talking. All eyes were on the woman at the piano, waiting for her to share her story. She sat there for a moment, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes distant. It was clear that wherever her mind had gone, it was far away from this small restaurant on this cold winter night. Giovanni waited patiently. He didn't push her. He didn't ask questions. He just sat there, giving her the space she needed. Finally, she began to speak. "I grew up in a small town in Eastern Europe," she said softly. "We didn't have much. My father worked in a factory. My mother cleaned houses for wealthy families. We lived in a tiny apartment with thin walls and a leaky roof. But we were happy. We had each other. And that was enough." She paused, a faint smile crossing her lips at the memory. "When I was 5 years old, my mother took me with her to one of the houses she cleaned. It was a big house, the biggest I had ever seen. And in the corner of the living room, there was a piano, a grand piano, black and shiny, like something out of a dream. I had never seen anything so beautiful in my life." Her fingers moved unconsciously to the keys in front of her, touching them gently as she spoke. The woman who owned the house saw me staring at it. She was kind. She asked if I wanted to try playing. I was so shy, I almost said no. But something pulled me toward that piano. I sat down on the bench, and I touched the keys. And when I heard the sound they made, something inside me woke up. Something that had been sleeping my whole life. Giovanni nodded slowly, completely absorbed in her words. "The woman told my mother that I had a gift. She said she could see it in the way I touched the keys, the way I listened to the sounds. She offered to give me lessons for free. She said it would be a waste to let talent like mine go undeveloped." The woman's voice grew heavier now, weighted with emotion. "For the next 12 years, I studied piano. Every day after school, I would go to that big house and practice for hours. The woman became like a second mother to me. She taught me everything she knew. She pushed me to be better, to work harder, to never give up. And when I was 17, she helped me apply to one of the best music conservatories in Europe." She stopped and took a shaky breath. "I got in, full scholarship. My parents cried when they heard the news. They had never imagined that their daughter, a girl from a poor family with nothing to her name, could achieve something like that. It was the proudest moment of my life." The elderly man in the corner leaned forward slightly, hanging on every word. There was something in his eyes, a recognition, like he understood exactly what she was describing. "The conservatory was hard," she continued. "Harder than anything I had ever done. The other students came from wealthy families. They had been playing since they were 3 years old. They had the best teachers, the best instruments, the best everything. And there I was, a nobody from a small town, trying to keep up." She shook her head slowly. "But I worked. I worked harder than anyone else. I practiced until my fingers bled. I stayed up late studying music theory. I gave everything I had to that dream, and slowly, I started to get noticed. My professors said I had something special, something that couldn't be taught. They said I played with my soul, not just my hands. A sad smile crossed her face. By the time I graduated, I had job offers from orchestras all over Europe. I was going to travel the world, performing in the greatest concert halls. I was going to make my parents proud. I was going to prove that a girl from nothing could become something. She stopped. The smile faded. And when she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. But life doesn't always go the way you plan. Giovanni felt his chest tighten. He could sense what was coming, even before she said it. A few months before my first big performance, I got a call from home. My mother was sick, very sick. The doctors said it was serious, and she needed treatment that cost more money than my family had ever seen in their lives. Tears began to form in her eyes, but she didn't wipe them away. I gave up everything. The job offers, the performances, all of it. I went home to take care of her. I worked odd jobs during the day and sat by her bed at night. I sold everything I owned to pay for her medicine. But it wasn't enough. It was never enough. Her voice broke, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. The room was so quiet, you could hear the wind outside. She passed away 2 years later. And my father, he couldn't handle the grief. He followed her 6 months after that, just gave up on life. I found him one morning, sitting in his chair, eyes closed, like he was sleeping. But he wasn't sleeping. Giovanni reached out and placed a hand gently on the edge of the piano. Not quite touching her, but close enough to offer comfort. After that, I had nothing, she said. No family, no money, no home. I tried to go back to music, but the world had moved on without me. The orchestras had found other pianists. The opportunities had dried up. I was forgotten. She looked down at her hands, thin and worn. I moved to this country thinking I could start over. I thought maybe here, things would be different. But it's hard to start over when you have nothing. No connections, no money, no proof of who you used to be. I took whatever work I could find. Cleaning, washing dishes, anything to survive. She let out a long, tired breath. But then I got sick too. Nothing as serious as my mother, but enough to keep me from working. I lost my job. Then I lost my apartment. And before I knew it, I was living on the streets, wondering how my life had fallen apart so completely. The young woman near the window was crying openly now. Her partner had his arm around her, his own eyes red and wet. I haven't touched a piano in over 2 years, she said quietly. I thought that part of my life was over. I thought the music inside me had died along with everyone I loved. She looked up at Giovanni, her eyes filled with a mixture of pain and gratitude. But tonight, when I walked past your restaurant and saw that piano through the window, something stirred inside me. Something I thought was gone forever. I knew I had to try. Even if it was just one last time. Even if no one listened. I had to play again. Giovanni felt tears rolling down his own cheeks now. He didn't bother to hide them. I didn't expect anyone to care, she whispered. I just wanted to feel like myself again. Even if only for a few minutes. The room was completely still. No one moved. No one spoke. The weight of her story hung in the air like fog, heavy and inescapable. Then, from the corner of the room, a chair scraped against the floor. The elderly man was standing again. But this time, he wasn't clapping. He was walking toward her, slowly and deliberately, his eyes never leaving her face. When he reached her, he stopped. He looked at her for a long moment. And then he spoke. "My dear," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I need to tell you something. And I need you to listen very carefully." The woman looked up at him, confused and a little frightened, and the entire restaurant held its breath, waiting to hear what he would say next. The elderly man stood before her, his eyes soft but serious. He was tall, even with his slightly hunched posture. His white hair was neatly combed back, and despite his age, there was a sharpness in his gaze that suggested a mind still very much alive. The woman looked up at him, uncertain. She didn't know what to expect. A kind word, maybe. Or perhaps he just wanted to tell her how much the music had moved him. She had heard such things before, back when she still performed, back when she was somebody. But what he said next changed everything. "That piece you played," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Chopin's Ballade, number 1, in G minor. I have heard it performed hundreds of times. By some of the greatest pianists in the world. In concert halls from Vienna to New York, from Tokyo to London." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But I have never, in all my years, heard it played the way you just played it." The woman blinked, unsure of how to respond. She opened her mouth to say something, maybe to thank him. But he held up a hand gently, asking her to wait. "Let me tell you who I am," he said. "My name is Bernard. For 50 years, I worked in the world of classical music. I started as a young man, barely out of school, working as an assistant for a small orchestra. Over time, I moved up. I became a talent scout, then a producer. Eventually, I spent 2 decades working with some of the finest symphony orchestras on the planet." A quiet murmur rippled through the restaurant. People exchanged glances, realizing that this wasn't just any old man eating soup in the corner. "I retired 5 years ago," Bernard continued. "My wife passed away, and I lost my appetite for the business. I moved to this city to be closer to my daughter and grandchildren. Most nights, I just stay home. But tonight, something made me come out. I don't know what it was. Maybe fate, maybe luck, maybe something else entirely." He looked at her with an intensity that made her heart skip a beat. "And then you walked in. A stranger in worn-out clothes, asking to play for food. And you sat down at that dusty old piano and played like your life depended on it." His voice cracked slightly. "Do you have any idea how rare that is? How many pianists I've seen who have perfect technique, perfect training, perfect everything, but no soul? They play the notes, but they don't feel them. They perform the music, but they don't live it." He shook his head slowly. "You are different. What you have cannot be taught. It cannot be bought. It comes from somewhere deep inside. From everything you've lived through. Everything you've lost. Everything you still hope for. That is what I heard tonight. And that is why I cannot let you walk out of here and disappear." The woman's eyes widened. She didn't understand what he was saying. Or maybe she did. But she was too afraid to believe it. "What do you mean?" she whispered. Bernard reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small card. It was simple, white, with just a name and a phone number printed on it. He held it out to her. "I may be retired," he said, "but I still have friends in this industry. Good friends. People who trust my judgment. And there is an orchestra in this city, a very good one, that happens to be looking for something fresh. Something real. They are tired of the same polished performers who play like machines. They want someone who can remind audiences why music matters." The woman stared at the card like it was a foreign object. Her hand trembled as she slowly reached out to take it. "I can't promise you anything," Bernard said honestly. "The music world is tough. You know that better than anyone. But I can promise you this. I will make a phone call. I will tell them what I saw here tonight, and I will do everything in my power to get you an audition." Tears spilled down the woman's cheeks. She couldn't stop them. She didn't even try. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Why would you do this for me? You don't even know me." Bernard smiled gently. It was the kind of smile that came from someone who had lived a long life and learned a few things along the way. "Because I've spent 50 years searching for talent," he said. "Real talent. The kind that makes you forget where you are and who you are. The kind that reaches into your chest and squeezes your heart. I found it a few times over the years, and every time, it was the greatest gift I could have received." He placed a hand over his heart. "Tonight, you gave me that gift. A stranger, with nothing to her name, walked into a little restaurant and reminded me why I fell in love with music in the first place. The least I can do is try to return the favor. The woman looked down at the card in her hand. Her vision was blurry from tears, but she could still make out the words. A name. A number. A lifeline. Giovanni, who had been watching the entire exchange in stunned silence, finally stepped forward. He placed a gentle hand on the woman's shoulder. "You came in here asking for a meal," he said softly. "But I think you found something much bigger than that." She looked up at him, then at Bernard, then around the room at all the faces, watching her. The young couple, still holding hands, their eyes filled with hope on her behalf. The family, the children looking at her like she was a hero from a storybook. The college students, quiet and respectful. Some of them wiping their eyes. For the first time in years, she didn't feel invisible. She didn't feel forgotten. She felt seen. "I don't know what to say," she finally managed. "I don't even know if I can still perform like I used to. It's been so long. I'm out of practice. I'm not the same person I was." Bernard shook his head firmly. "What I heard tonight was not the playing of someone who has lost their gift. It was the playing of someone who has been through fire and come out stronger. You are not less than you were. You are more. You just need someone to give you a chance to prove it." He gestured toward the card in her hand. "Call that number tomorrow. Tell them Bernard sent you. They'll know what that means." The woman clutched the card tightly, like it was the most precious thing she had ever held. Giovanni clapped his hands together, breaking the heavy emotion with a warm smile. "But first," he said, "you are going to sit down and eat the best meal you've ever had. On the house. No arguments." A few people in the restaurant laughed softly, the tension finally easing. "And," Giovanni added, pointing a playful finger at her, "if you ever want to come back and play that piano again, you are welcome here any time. In fact, I insist on it." The woman laughed through her tears. It was a strange sound, one she hadn't heard from herself in a long time. It felt foreign, but it also felt good. Bernard patted her gently on the arm. "Get some rest tonight," he said. "Eat, sleep, take care of yourself. Because if things go the way I think they will, your life is about to change." He turned and walked back to his table, leaving her sitting there with a card in one hand and a heart full of something she had almost forgotten how to feel. Hope. Giovanni guided her to a table near the window and disappeared into the kitchen. Minutes later, he returned with a plate piled high with pasta, fresh bread, and a glass of wine. "Eat," he said simply. "You've earned it." And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she did. Outside, the snow had started to fall. Soft, white flakes drifted past the window, covering the cold, hard streets in a blanket of quiet beauty. And somewhere in her chest, buried under years of pain and loss, a small flame began to flicker back to life. Tomorrow, she would make that call. Tomorrow, everything could change. But tonight, she would simply be grateful for a warm meal, a kind stranger, and the music that had refused to let her go. 6 months had passed since that cold winter night. 6 months since a hungry woman walked into a small Italian restaurant and asked to play piano for a meal. 6 months since everything changed. The city symphony hall was packed. Every seat was filled. People in elegant dresses and fine suits settled into their chairs, flipping through programs and whispering excitedly to one another. The chandeliers overhead glittered like stars, casting a warm golden glow across the grand room. It was the kind of place where dreams were made and legends were born. Backstage, the woman stood alone in front of a mirror. She barely recognized herself. Her hair was styled beautifully. Her dress, a deep midnight blue, fit her perfectly. Her cheeks had filled out, and there was color in her face again. She looked healthy. She looked alive. But inside, her heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. It had been a whirlwind since that night at Giovanni's restaurant. She had made the call the very next morning, just like Bernard told her to. Her hands had been shaking so badly she could barely hold the phone, but she did it. She made the call. The audition came 2 weeks later. She had practiced every day leading up to it, using a keyboard at a local shelter that had taken her in. It wasn't the same as a real piano, but it was enough. When the day finally arrived, she walked into that audition room with nothing but her talent and her story, and she played like her life depended on it. Because in many ways, it still did. 3 days later, she got the call. They wanted her. Not just for one performance, but for an entire season. She would be their featured soloist, the centerpiece of their spring concert series. She had cried for an hour after hanging up the phone. Now, standing backstage at the Symphony Hall, all of that felt like a distant dream. The reality of the moment was almost too much to bear. In just a few minutes, she would walk out onto that stage and perform in front of thousands of people. People who had paid good money to hear her play. People who expected greatness. What if she failed? What if she froze? What if the magic that had saved her that night in the restaurant was gone? A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she said quietly. The door opened, and there stood Giovanni, dressed in a suit that looked like it hadn't been worn in years. His hair was combed back, and he was grinning from ear to ear. "Look at you," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "You clean up pretty good." She laughed, feeling some of the tension ease from her shoulders. "I can't believe you closed the restaurant for this," she said. Giovanni waved his hand dismissively. "Are you kidding? I wouldn't miss this for the world. Besides, my whole family is out there. My wife, my kids, even my mother. She's 87 years old and she hasn't left the house in 3 years. But when I told her about you, she insisted on coming." The woman felt tears prick at her eyes. "Giovanni, I don't know how to thank you for everything." He stepped forward and took her hands in his. His grip was warm and steady. "You don't need to thank me," he said softly. "You walked into my restaurant with nothing, and you gave us something we'll never forget. That music, that moment, it changed all of us. So tonight, you go out there, and you show the world what we already know. You are extraordinary." She squeezed his hands tightly, unable to speak. Giovanni smiled and stepped back. "Now, I better get to my seat before my wife sends a search party. But I'll be watching. We all will." He gave her one last nod and disappeared through the door. A few minutes later, another knock came. This time, it was Bernard. He looked distinguished in his dark suit and silver tie. His eyes were bright with pride. "How are you feeling?" he asked gently. "Terrified," she admitted. Bernard chuckled. "Good. That means you care. The day you stop feeling nervous before a performance is the day you stop being an artist." He walked over and stood beside her, both of them looking into the mirror. "I've seen a lot of performers in my life," he said quietly. "Some of them were technically perfect. Some of them were famous beyond measure. But very few of them had what you have. That thing inside you. That fire. It's rare. Don't ever let anyone make you feel like you don't belong here. Because you do. More than anyone I've ever known." She turned to look at him, her eyes glistening. "Thank you for believing in me," she whispered. "When I had stopped believing in myself." Bernard placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "That's what we do for each other," he said. "We carry each other's hope when they can't carry it themselves. Now go out there and remind the world why music matters." He gave her a warm smile and left the room. Alone again, she turned back to the mirror. She looked at herself, really looked, and for the first time in years, she didn't see a failure. She didn't see a woman who had lost everything. She saw a survivor, a fighter, someone who had been through the fire and come out the other side. The stage manager appeared at the door. 2 minutes, she said. The woman nodded. She took one last deep breath, smoothed down her dress, and walked toward the stage. The lights were blinding at first. The applause thundered through the hall like a wave crashing against the shore. She walked slowly toward the grand piano at the center of the stage. her heels clicking softly against the polished wood floor. When she sat down on the bench, the room fell silent. Thousands of eyes watched her. Thousands of hearts waited. She placed her fingers on the keys. They were cool and smooth, familiar and welcoming. Like coming home after a long, long journey. She closed her eyes, and she began to play. The music flowed out of her like water from a spring. It was the same piece she had played that night in the restaurant, Chopin's Ballade No. 1. But it was different now. Richer. Deeper. It carried all the pain of her past, all the hope of her future, all the gratitude she felt for everyone who had helped her along the way. In the audience, Giovanni sat with tears streaming down his face, his wife clutching his hand. Bernard watched with quiet pride, nodding slowly to the rhythm. The elderly woman, Giovanni's mother, had her eyes closed, a peaceful smile on her lips, and somewhere in the middle of the crowd, a young girl sat with her parents. She was maybe 10 or 11 years old, with wide eyes and messy hair. She watched the woman on stage with an expression of pure wonder. Her small hands rested on her lap, her fingers moving slightly, as if she were playing along in her imagination. When the final note faded into silence, there was a moment of stillness. Then the audience erupted. People leaped to their feet. The applause was deafening. A roar of appreciation and admiration that shook the very walls of the hall. The woman stood and bowed, tears falling freely down her cheeks. She looked out at the sea of faces, at all these strangers who had come to hear her play, and she felt something she thought she had lost forever. She felt whole. Later that night, after the flowers and the congratulations and the endless handshakes, she found herself standing outside Giovanni's restaurant. The lights were on inside, warm and inviting. She pushed open the door and stepped inside. The same old piano sat in the corner, still dusty, still waiting. Giovanni looked up from behind the counter and smiled. "Welcome home," he said. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, that was exactly what it felt like. Home.